So how do these programs compare? I'm an economist, and in the last stimulus bill, there was a lot of concern about how should we spend our money? Should we spend it, like I said earlier, on potholes? Should we have bridges, infrastructure, airports? Or what's the rate of return on something like early childhood? Well, I mentioned 7 to 10% is a very, very high rate of return, much higher than most most proposals that have been put forward under the stimulus package. And when we look at the later interventions, even in the life of the child, so we ask, for example, about programs that are designed to fix rather than avoid the problems, that we generally have low rates of return. I did an evaluation of the so-called Job Training Partnership Program years ago. That program was designed to help disadvantaged young men and young women. And I found, for example, that this program, which was really a kind of an outgrowth again of the war on poverty, that program actually had a negative effect for the young men that participated, a negative effect on earnings. Why? The programs were short-term in nature. It diverted them away from getting a good job. It simply wasn't adding any value. So I'm not saying that we can't solve these other problems. We can't remediate later. But what all the economics shows and what all the discussion shows is that, in fact, it's much more costly if, in fact, it's even feasible to intervene later on. And so all the other policies that are currently on the table, job training, classroom size reduction, adult literacy, tuition reduction programs, all have the policy feature that they're much less successful. The rates of return are much, much lower than they are for interventions that actually attack the problem right at the start of life. And so when we look at these policies and we look at this, and there are a whole set of these policies. I mentioned two. One is the Perry program, the other is the Abecedarian program, but there are many, many other programs, all of which show very high economic returns. Most recently, the Obama administration has been looking at so-called nurse-family partnership program, which actually is a visiting program where nurses are going to the homes of teenage mothers, many of whom less educated, many of whom don't know the simple facts that smoking and drinking while carrying a child can have adverse effects, that reading to a child can have substantial positive effects. And when we follow children from these programs, where we randomly assign children to treatment and control, look 20 years later, we see substantial positive effects from these interventions. So what we've learned then is that there is a dynamics here, that early skills beget later skills. Early motivations set in place forces that actually produce later skills. All capabilities are built on a foundation of capacities that are developed earlier. And the early intervention lowers the cost of later investment. So that we need to incorporate this into public policy. And so the general rule is that the earlier the investment for any given level of disadvantage, the higher the economic rate of return. And what's strange is that in American society today, we spend so much money on remediation, so much on the prisons, so much on various kinds of patch-ups to society at large, and so little on investment in the early years where the return can be so effective. So let me summarize my talk. First of all, I want to illustrate, and I've tried to illustrate the point that skills matter. Skills matter substantially. America has a skills problem, and many other countries do as well. Rising inequality is a sign of this problem. But what we see in place now is a rising inequality that promises to perpetuate itself over the generations. We're becoming a more polarized society. The middle class is vanishing. There are more college graduates, and there are more dropouts. And we also have learned, and this is something I can't say enough, that more than smarts is required for success, and that our current policy overemphasizes smarts. If you want to raise the score, even on a No Child Left Behind test, it turns out that social and emotional motivation plays a very powerful role. The Perry people, these same people who had no higher IQ, have higher achievement tests. That means they're not only smarter, they're just more motivated to learn. They're more engaged in seeking, in trying to pursue life. So what we've demonstrated then is these social and emotional skills are hard skills. We have learned to measure them. We don't have a 100-year history on them as we do with IQ, but we do have a long history in the last 30 years, and we show very powerful effects. But we also know that these skill gaps, these important skill gaps, emerge early, and they can be traced in part to adverse early environments. And that schools are much less responsible for, and can be much less of a vehicle for solving our problems than it's currently thought to be the case in policy discussions today. Late remediation, especially for the most disadvantaged, is not very effective. Remediation can work, but it's costly. And so I think the lesson that I've tried to communicate today, and I think will be here throughout the week when we talk about children, the Sesame Street group and the discussion about social policy that will culminate in discussion on Friday, is that social policy should be directed towards the malleable early years if we want to address social problems and to make America a truly excellent society. Thank you very much for your attention.